Welcome to the Explainer. So today we are looking at something that is basically going to redefine how we acquire new skills. If you've ever felt like you've just hit a brick wall with your language learning, where no amount of extra studying seems to make a difference, we are going to give you a completely new perspective on how your brain processes language. We're going to lay this out in a simple, flat, 2D way to really map out how to hack your plateau. We're going to shift our focus away from daytime study volume and instead look at the precision of nighttime processing.
First off, let's just address the elephant in the room. Why is it that the words you cram today just vanish by morning? It's an incredibly frustrating experience, and honestly, we have all been there. You pour hours into grammar drills, you highlight vocabulary lists until your textbook is literally glowing neon, and you feel this great sense of accomplishment. But then you wake up the next day, try to recall that exact phrase you practiced 20 times, and it's just gone. It's literally like pouring water into a bucket with a giant hole in the bottom.
And that exact frustration brings us to this incredibly stark, paradigm-shifting quote. You don't learn when you study. You learn when you sleep. Let that sink in for a second. This idea completely challenges our traditional worldview on effort versus biological timing. We're so conditioned to believe that the act of staring at a page is the act of learning, but science tells us a very different story. The studying is just the gathering of materials, the actual assembly of those materials into a usable structure. That only happens when you close your eyes.
Okay, let's dive into this. Here is our agenda for today, mapped out on a clear 2D plane. First up, the illusion of volume. Second, your brain's biological bottleneck. Third, the neural fluency equation. Fourth, the effort to retention matrix. And finally, the exact sequence you need, the Twilight Protocol.
All right, section 1, the illusion of volume. Let's talk about the volume trap.
It feels like time just melts away when we get caught in this trap, doesn't it? We kind of just assume that grinding out 3 uninterrupted hours of grammar drills guarantees fluency, but then the words vanish anyway. The absolute crucial point to remember here is that the failure isn't your work ethic, not at all. The failure is your timing. More hours do not equal more connections in the brain if the brain isn't biologically primed to receive them.
Moving right along to section 2, your brain's biological bottleneck.
So, picture your brain's intake capacity during the day as a literal 2-dimensional funnel. While you're awake, you are constantly bombarded with stimuli. Work, traffic, hours of language classes. When you try to force massive amounts of new input into a system that is already completely fatigued, the funnel just overflows. The raw data literally spills right over the edges. It results in lost vocabulary and wasted effort, and only a tiny, tiny fraction actually drips through to retention.
And you know, that bottleneck actually has a scientific name. It's the hippocampus. This is your brain's short-term memory center. And honestly, it's pretty fragile. It is severely limited in how much it can hold during your waking hours. If you try to jam hundreds of new words in there in a single afternoon, it simply can't take it all. It is a biological hardware limitation, guys. It's not a software bug in your study routine.
And this brilliantly illustrates what happens when you finally stop and rest. Your brain essentially turns into a neural weaver. Memory consolidation kicks into high gear. While you're fast asleep, your brain is actively replaying the vocabulary and structures you just learned. It physically moves that information out of that fragile, overwhelmed short-term storage of the hippocampus and weaves it into the permanent, hardwired neural networks of the neocortex. That is where your long-term memory actually lives.
Which brings us to section 3, the neural fluency equation.
Think of this like a perfectly balanced mathematical equation on a flat plane. On the left side, you've got your input. That's your classes, your reading, your study time. This side is all about gathering the raw data. But, and this is absolutely crucial, gathering raw data is completely useless without the right side of the equation, processing. Deep sleep is what actually builds those neural connections. If you spend hours on daytime classes, you only solve for the left side. Without prioritizing the right side, the whole equation just collapses. You have to have both for permanent, accessible fluency.
All right, section 4, the effort to retention matrix. Let's look at how to optimize this.
Now, what's really interesting when we break this down into a matrix is the stark contrast between our traditional methods and biological efficiency. Look at the marathon approach. It demands 2 to 3 hours of daytime study. Your cognitive load is completely maxed out, you're distracted by a million daily tasks, and memory transfer is delayed. But then look at the sprint and sleep approach. It takes literally 15 minutes. The cognitive load is low, there are 0 competing stimuli, and the memory transfer is immediate. By placing a short burst of study right before sleep, you're effectively skipping the daytime bottleneck entirely.
Finally, let's jump into section 5,
the 15-minute twilight protocol. So how do we transition from theory to practice? Well, it takes precision. I want to be super clear here. You definitely do not need to read another dense textbook chapter right before bed. No way. What you actually need is a highly curated 15-minute slice of time, a strict sequence designed exclusively to prime your brain for overnight processing. It is entirely about quality and timing, not volume.
Let's map out this exact linear sequence to see how it builds. You're going to want to execute this right before you turn off the lights. Step 1 is target review. Spend just a few minutes going over flashcards for, say, 5 to 10 specific words you struggled with earlier that day. Step 2 is passive audio. Just close your eyes and listen to a natural, familiar dialogue. And step 3 is mental rehearsal. Visualize yourself in a very 2D straightforward way using those target words in a real conversation. Let those clear language patterns be the absolute final data your brain registers for the day.
To make sure this actually works, we need to create some rigid boundaries, splitting this into a flat left versus right comparison. Do review specific words, do listen to familiar audio, and do visualize. But absolutely don't try to tackle brand new complex grammar, don't read dense academic texts, and please don't do anything that causes cognitive spikes or frustration. The goal right before sleep is gentle, highly specific priming. No heavy lifting allowed. Keep it simple and keep it incredibly focused.
Which brings us to our final and maybe most important takeaway. Sleep is not a break from learning. Sleep is the most critical phase of the learning process itself. When you use the Twilight Protocol, you're finally aligning your effort with your biology instead of constantly fighting against it. So tonight, skip the 3-hour cram session, close the textbook, turn off the lights, and let your sleeping brain do the actual heavy lifting. If just 15 minutes of nighttime priming can outperform hours of daytime drilling, you really have to ask yourself, what other biological advantages are you currently sleeping on?